So we've read a lot about Facebook now. Facebook says, don't even go to a newspaper or a news site anymore. Just come to us. We'll serve every need you can possibly think of. So how much traffic does social, mainly Facebook, send? So most dailies get 8 to 12% of all the traffic they get from social, mainly Facebook. But innovative company like Deseret Media in Salt Lake, 30%. WBUR, good public radio station in Boston, 33%. New business site, Quartz, 60%. And then BuzzFeed, which is a phenomenon, 75%. Vox Media, which got famous when Ezra Klein joined Vox from the Washington Post, for instance, takes this whole strategy and says, we're not going to spend one dime on marketing. They depend wholly on social to get the word out. Most legacy media have been very slow in understanding how to do this. And now we have this latest angle to it where Facebook says put all the content there, and it's what I call the ubiquity game. They have 5 to 6 hours of usage a month on average. Most news sites have 5 to 15 minutes. And so this whole question of where people are going to read the news is coming up once again. And if you have a child who's looking for a job or a friend, 18,000 jobs are open in social media management. Just incredible. So what is this? This is free marketing. We have become each other's editors, and media and news media are trying to figure out how to harness this phenomenon. Mobile is obsolete. Desktop is the new print. Desktop minutes are decreasing for news media. Even though we multitask, we only have so much time, and majority mobile is upon us. So mobile majority this year is happening across more than 50% of page views for many news companies are mobile. And how long will it last? About that long. The idea that we have, and most people in this room sat in front of a desktop, this whole idea of sitting in front of a desktop, that's another kind of cartoon from another age. It's kind of a silly thing, but when I remember we got our first Apple II GS, it was an amazement, but you're tethered there. And the idea of us having to be tethered to our information sources, our memory offload, is a really old idea already. So how do we split now? Desktop minutes, about 50%, kind of trending down to 45%. And these are for news companies specifically. Smartphone minutes, 35. Tablet minutes, about 15. So you add up 35, 15, you got the 50%. And where this is going, 2020 no longer seems like a mythical year, right? 5 years away. Probably 75% mobile. At some point, and being close to Silicon Valley, I think that it's real. The internet not only will be on us, we got our Apple Watches coming, it'll be in us. But that's not, it's going to happen. But 25%. So lastly, relationship newsonomics. Let's look at New York Times subscriptions. 1995, a fairly amazing number. There were 1.5 million paying subscribers to New York Times. Now think back, those of you who are around 1995, New York Times was fabulously successful, confident, even more arrogant than they are today. They're still arrogant. They've managed to maintain their arrogance, which they deserve a Pulitzer for that. Drew, that is true, right? Not you, but very confident. Nobody would say, oh, I'm sorry, you work for a newspaper company. You know, people say, oh, you work for the New York Times. Wonderful, right? 1.5 million paying readers. Today, 1.5 to 2 million paying readers. Basically the same number. 2 million is Sunday, 1.5 million is daily. 900,000 are digital only. So look at this world and let's figure out what this means. This means the whole world changed, except it didn't. The same number of people roughly said New York Times is worth a number of hundreds of dollars a year as an information source to me. Population's grown greatly in that 20-year period too. So we can give them the benefit of the doubt and say up to 2 million. Basically the same number of people. What this tells us is the economics we've been thinking about are all askew. They have 60% of their revenue coming from readers. They have transitioned largely. They have now 300,000 more digital subscribers than print in 4 years. But what do they have? A substantial news and information product. So I believe the future of the news business is in relationships. And that these are deep relationships, they're wide relationships, they're based on data, what we like to call in the industry first-party data. We have a relationship with a business and they can use the data to improve a product. Mark Thompson talks about, he's the CEO of the New York Times, he talks about working the engagement curve. So what's old is new here. You got merchants relationships, you got reader relationships, you have community relationships. It's the same kind of relationships, they just need to be exercised differently. The problem has been that through the digital revolution, newspapers and news organizations, forget the paper part of it, are less a part of people's lives than they used to be. This was the village center. This is where all of this started. There would be a newspaper building. You think about how many newspaper buildings have been sold across the United States with their big signs, and people would say, yeah, that's my newspaper. And they go into sometimes better headquarters, as the Oregonian has, but they lose their branding. So what do we know about when people use newspapers online now? Newspapers online, we know what they're reading, what they're buying, what they're shopping for, what they're doing. And sometimes they're just passing time. Compare the newspaper of 1995, or even 2005. It had 4 sections, if you remember that, 4 fat sections in it. You could have the sports section and the lifestyle section and the local news section and the A section. And it would have many of the functions that you now have on the first screen of your smartphone. If you wanted to know about sports scores, you knew where to go. If you wanted to find restaurants, on Thursday you could find a directory, you'd find reviews, etc., etc. This page has replaced much of what a daily newspaper does, and does it much better in many ways. How many of you have on your phone a local news app? And if you have a local news app, about half here, that's probably one. So that's a screen of, what's that, 20 or 24. Maybe you have a local news app, maybe you have a national news app, so maybe 2 or 3 out of 24. What newspapers have done, when I talk about a failure of imagination, is they haven't understood that they were so much more than just saying, here's the 6 headlines of the day, and figured out how to do the kinds of things here that Yelp does, or that MLB does, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They've shrunken in their purpose, and they've shrunken in their business, and they've shrunken in their relationship. I interviewed Matthias Döpfner. He's the head of Axel Springer, which is the largest media company in Europe now, making major investments in the US. Very interesting character. And among the things he said that stayed with me is, he said, data is the new paper. And we talked about what that meant. And at first I didn't know quite what he meant. And he said, look, basically the old days, the paper was news. It was, and readers paid you for the news. So you had reader revenue, circulation revenue. You had display advertising, you had classified advertising. Great business, oodles of money, everybody was happy. These 3 things, the news, the display, the department store ads, and the classifieds, were 3 things, but we as readers thought they were one thing. They were in the newspaper, they were the newspaper. They flowed together. It was this happy convergence that we thought was going to last forever. He said now they've broken apart eternally by the web. He said, but they come together in data. If you pay attention to how people are shopping, how they're buying cars, what they're reading, and you can bring that data together, data becomes the new paper. So data is the basis of relationship newsonomics. And you go back to this question of who are your customers? Your customers aren't all those millions of page views you get on the web. It's great, and some of those people will become regular readers, and it's wonderful to have them. But it's really, what you care about is your top 10 to 15%. Those people who are coming back often to your website 2, 3, 4 times a month and spending time. What do they read? What, when, on what? What do they shop for? What do they buy? What do they save? What do they share? And the question, of course, isn't what does my newsroom now create that I can give them, but what do they want? What does the customer want that I could give them? It's about hunch and munch. So we glory in journalism lore, front page, and being tough and that kind of image. And certainly, editorial intuition and judgment retains its power and is very, very important. But this guy, who doesn't look like this guy, he looks like a nerd, and he is. He's the head nerd at FT, a guy named Tom Betts, brilliant data scientist, now heads a group of 30 people at the Financial Times, founded, I think, 1850s, and they're doing the munching, right? They're munching all the data. You take the hunch of really good editors and journalists, and you combine it, and it's a pretty simple world, but you've got to do that combination to make it work. And then this guy, he apparently has a good time being the head of Amazon, now owning the Washington Post. He spent only $250 million. He bought hundreds of thousands of paying relationships. This is what's key when we understand Amazon. It's all about data and analytics. Started a national network now. And what is this about? Selling more stuff. The old world comes around in a circle. It's selling more stuff. Technology is the new center of this business. It's about little data. I call it little data because it's not the big data that's big and scary and coming to get you. It's those little pieces of information that help the FT make a better product. So this is our guy with the paper bag. Analytics. We're moving from a world of anonymous, where newspaper companies threw a newspaper at our house, didn't even know our names, but they knew our address, to known. We can know all these things about readers. And if we don't act on that knowledge, the game is over. Amazon, when I talked to FT 7 years ago, they said, we looked at all the newspaper models, we couldn't find any that worked. It was Amazon that worked. And they have modeled their company on Amazon. And now Amazon essentially has bought the Washington Post. So relationships provide the data, touch points, and knowledge. And what we're trying to create in this quest for a new model is a new virtuous circle. We had a virtuous circle. People had the newspaper, they could do their shopping, they can do their reading, and it all worked for decades and decades. We're trying to recreate that now in terms of reading, advertising, events they might go to, and the center of it is all data. Here, the national local news chasm is growing. Money is just pumping into BuzzFeed and Vox and Vice and all of these national companies, more than $500 million in the last 2 years. It's a very good business to be in if you're national and global. They're focusing on growth. They're not focusing on profit at this point. And again, jobs. We got 18,000 social media. We got 6,000 jobs have been created by new national media companies. These are all news jobs, tend to be pretty good jobs, and hiring the best people they can, largely on the Eastern Seaboard for this kind of work. Ezra Klein jumps over to the Vox from the Washington Post at the age of 29. We have young personalities, new voices, BuzzFeed, really pioneered for the new age high-low journalism, which newspapers have done for a long time, reinvented the medium. And we do have, when we look at the national, you have the new national guys who are focusing on growth. Some of them will survive. Rupert Murdoch will buy some of them. Disney will buy some of them. Some of them will fade away. And you have companies like the Journal, the Times, the Guardian. They are crossing over they have such scale to be able to reach national and global audiences that they are able to do a lot. And they are making this transition really from an analog world to a digital world. So it's working on a national and global level. Local is another story. News staff is down 20,000. So 20,000 jobs have been lost in the United States over the last 8 years in newsrooms. Down to the mid-30,000s now. What do we have? We have loss of news, loss of experience. So even when you have the same number of people, if you have somebody who's 25 years old, they probably know less about the community than the 52-year-old they replaced, who cost too much money. We have a loss of intelligence in the reporting. This quality I've been thinking about, and it's really hard. How do you quantify any of this stuff other than the 20,000, right? But the idea of wit. Well, we know we see it in national media, but there's a kind of denseness to local media where they report stuff, but you kind of, if you're a longtime reader, you say, well, they missed this and they missed that. Have you had that feeling with reading the press? And it's hard to put your finger on it. And this one I'm trying to think about here is wit. It's clear, and newspapers always had their problems. I'm deeply critical in my years in the newspapers, but still more loss. And then what we could call civic capital. That's been waning as well. There's a kind of denseness to local media where they report stuff, but you kind of, if you're a longtime reader, you say, well, they missed this and they missed that. Have you had that feeling with reading the press? And it's hard to put your finger on it. And this one I'm trying to think about here is wit. It's clear, and newspapers always had their problems. I'm deeply critical in my years in the newspapers, but still more loss. And then what we could call civic capital. That's been waning as well. So if we go to, this is another one of the many ways I'm trying to figure out and wrestle with this question of what is journalism. So what did we learn? I even learned this in 1973. Pretty tough professors, I remember. Well, you remember this, right? Well, okay, it's pretty basic. That's news, right? So much of what's happened in the digital world, not all of it, there's some really good journalism being produced by these new national companies, for instance, but mainly what digital technology does is focus on these. So we have Meerkat came along. How many of you have heard of Meerkat? So Meerkat, I was at South by Southwest on the first day, and I was doing a talk, and I was trying to move around a little as I do, and the guy said, this is a organizer there. He said, you can't move. And I said, why can't I move? He said, Meerkat, Meerkat. And I had been busy that day, so I didn't know that Meerkat had launched that day. And he's yelling, Meerkat, Meerkat. And he's got his iPhone, and he's doing this is a live streaming. If we put video, I could hold up my phone right now and take pictures of everybody here, and everybody could see it. So Meerkat launches a month ago or so, and their big coup is Madonna walking somewhere. This is, and it's supposed to be this incredible revolution. It could be used in some interesting ways by news companies, I think, but this is, again, it's like, wow, look, we can capture reality. The problem, I think, as I've thought about this, is these questions of news that we care about most and where we're deficient in the intelligence and the wit and the depth and the experience is how and why. We just don't understand what's going on because we don't have people who are explaining it to us who know about it. It was always uneven, and newspapers always had problems with that, but it's a lot less. Now, we can count how many fewer stories there may be, but we can't count this other stuff. In a sense, we don't know what we don't know, but we know less. So, some truths. Print's decline is nonstop. It is an amazement. People are coming to accept it, but it's a slow, slow acceptance. So I love these numbers. I found these numbers. The New York Daily News, owned by Mort Zuckerman, put it on the market, said, I'd like to get maybe $125 million for the New York Daily News. despite the fact that it's losing about $30 million a year. And so his first offer was a very generous offer of $1. And he's trying to get the price up. So if we look at, as a prism of where newspapers have been, the New York Daily News, at its peak, had a Sunday circulation of 4.7 million copies. Daily, 2.4 million. Okay, when was that? Let's hear a couple of guesses. When do you think the peak was for the New York Daily News? 89. 89? And what else? 75. One more over here. 72. Okay. 1947. Now, if you were born since 1947, raise your hand. It's not a tough exercise. So, yes, the internet has caused damage to American newspapers and European newspapers and Asian newspapers, but if you look at the charts, the decline of daily journalism started roughly in the late 40s and the 50s, way beyond the imagination of most people alive today.